The moment no one believed possible has just happened, and it didn't arrive with a dramatic press conference or a televised announcement, but with a quiet, almost surgical precision that has left leaders across Europe staring at their screens in disbelief. Before we roll the footage, just one thing. If you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed, perfect. Now enjoy the video, because in the early hours of the morning, a sealed directive from Washington landed inside the highest levels of the European Union, not as a proposal or an invitation to negotiate, but as a declaration of terms that carried with it a 30-day deadline capable of reshaping the balance of global power in ways that few had seriously prepared for. And while the public is only now beginning to hear fragments of what unfolded, the truth is that this moment has been building for months behind closed doors, inside private meetings, classified briefings, and strategic sessions that were never meant to see daylight. What makes this moment so explosive is not just the content of the directive, but the tone that came with it. Because according to insiders who have seen the original transmission, there was no diplomatic cushioning, no language of partnership, no familiar references to shared values or mutual respect, but instead a stark and unapologetic framework that reduced decades of transatlantic cooperation into a series of measurable transactions, each one evaluated, calculated, and ultimately judged. And at the centre of that judgment was a conclusion that European officials are now scrambling to contain. A conclusion that effectively reframes the entire relationship as one-sided, unsustainable, and in urgent need of correction. Within minutes of the directive being received in Brussels, emergency protocols were activated and senior figures inside the European Commission were pulled into crisis meetings that stretched through the night as communication lines between capitals lit up with urgency, because this was not the kind of situation that could be deferred or quietly managed. And as fragments of the document began to circulate among a small circle of policymakers, the scale of the challenge became impossible to ignore, especially as it became clear that this was not an opening move in a negotiation, but rather the final stage of a strategy that had already been decided. The first real shock came from the data itself, because embedded within the directive was a comprehensive audit of economic and defence relations stretching back decades. And according to sources familiar with its contents, the figures presented were not only detailed, but strategically arranged to support a narrative that places the burden of imbalance squarely on Europe, with trade deficits, defence contributions and regulatory asymmetries all highlighted in a way that reinforces a single overarching message. And that message is already echoing through political circles with a force that is difficult to overstate, because it challenges not just policy decisions, but the very legitimacy of the current structure. As the morning progressed, leaks began to surface. First in whispers across encrypted messaging platforms, then through carefully worded reports from major outlets like an Eye, both of which cited unnamed officials describing the situation as unprecedented, while analysts connected to began offering early interpretations that framed the directive as a potential turning point in modern geopolitical history. And although the language remained cautious in public, the urgency behind the scenes was unmistakable. What escalated the situation from serious to critical was the emergence of a specific clause within the directive, one that outlined the consequences of non-compliance in terms that left little room for ambiguity, because it referenced a legal mechanism that grants sweeping authority to impose tariffs and trade restrictions unilaterally, without the need for prolonged negotiations or international arbitration. And once this detail became known, the markets reacted almost instantly, with major European indices dropping sharply as investors attempted to process the implications of a scenario in which access to the American market could be restricted with minimal warning. The economic exposure is not theoretical, and that is precisely what makes it so dangerous, because European industries have spent decades integrating themselves into a system that relies heavily on transatlantic trade. With hundreds of billions in goods flowing annually into the United States, and entire sectors from automotive manufacturing to luxury goods and pharmaceuticals structured around that demand, meaning that any disruption would not unfold gradually, but rather hit with immediate force, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond corporate balance sheets into employment, social stability, and political cohesion. Inside Europe, the reactions have been anything but unified. And this fragmentation is rapidly becoming one of the most critical aspects of the crisis because while Germany has signalled a preference for negotiation and de-escalation, France has adopted a more confrontational tone in public statements, hinting at potential countermeasures while simultaneously exploring diplomatic backchannels. And in Eastern Europe, now, where security concerns carry a different weight, the response has been marked by a growing sense of vulnerability, as leaders quietly reassess their strategic options in a landscape that suddenly feels far less predictable. At the same time, public sentiment is beginning to shift as awareness of the situation spreads beyond political and financial circles into the broader population, where existing frustrations related to economic pressure and institutional trust are already high, and analysts are warning that the addition of a major external shock could act as a catalyst for unrest, particularly in regions where unemployment and inequality remain persistent challenges. And early indicators suggest that various groups, including labour organisations and activist networks, are already preparing for the possibility of rapid change. Yet, even as the economic and political dimensions of the crisis continue to unfold, there is another element that has the potential to redefine the narrative entirely, and that is the reported existence of a dossier currently circulating within select channels in Washington, a document that allegedly contains detailed information about activities linked to European entities that extend beyond traditional diplomacy, and while the specifics have not been officially confirmed, the mere possibility of its release is enough to trigger concern at the highest levels of European leadership. If the claims associated with this dossier gain traction, the implications would extend far beyond policy disputes because they would introduce questions about influence, accountability, and the integrity of institutional actions, creating a situation in which the focus shifts from economic imbalance to political legitimacy, and that is a transition that carries far greater consequences, particularly in an environment where public trust is already under strain. Behind closed doors, preparations are underway for multiple scenarios, with legal teams conducting internal reviews, communication strategists developing response frameworks, and policymakers attempting to coordinate positions that can withstand both internal and external scrutiny. But the challenge lies in the fact that time is limited, and the complexity of the situation makes consensus difficult to achieve, especially when national interests begin to diverge. One of the most significant developments in recent hours has been the indication that some European countries may be considering bilateral approaches to Washington, effectively bypassing the collective framework in an effort to secure more favourable outcomes for themselves. And while this strategy may offer short-term advantages, it also introduces the risk of undermining the cohesion of the broader alliance, creating a dynamic in which unity becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. This possibility is being closely monitored by analysts because it represents a potential tipping point, one in which the structure of cooperation that has defined the region for decades begins to shift toward a more fragmented model. And once that process begins, reversing it becomes exponentially more challenging, and particularly under the pressure of an active deadline. As each day passes, the sense of urgency continues to grow, not only within government institutions, but also across financial markets, media narratives, and public discourse, all of which are feeding into a feedback loop that amplifies the stakes of every development. And while there are still efforts underway to find a path toward resolution, the window for doing so is narrowing with each passing hour. What makes this situation uniquely volatile is the combination of factors at play, because it is not driven by a single issue or disagreement, but rather by a convergence of economic, political, and strategic tensions that have been accumulating over time, and the directive that triggered the current crisis has effectively brought all of those tensions to the surface at once, forcing a reckoning that can no longer be postponed. The question now is not whether the relationship between the United States and Europe will change, because that outcome appears increasingly likely, but rather how that change will manifest, and whether it will be managed in a way that preserves stability or unfolds in a manner that accelerates division. And the answer to that question will depend on decisions being made right now in rooms that the public will never see, by individuals whose choices will shape the trajectory of the global order for years to come. As the deadline approaches, the pressure will only intensify, and the margin for error will continue to shrink, creating an environment in which even small miscalculations could have outsized consequences. And while there is still uncertainty about the exact form that those consequences will take, there is a growing consensus among observers that the outcome of this 30-day window will represent a defining moment, not just for Europe or the United States, but for the international system as a whole. So the world is now watching, waiting, and trying to understand what comes next, because the signals are clear, even if the details remain incomplete. And the trajectory suggests that we are moving toward a point from which there may be no easy return, raising questions that extend far beyond the immediate crisis. Questions about the durability of alliances, the distribution of power, and the future of cooperation in an increasingly uncertain world. Will Europe find a way to respond as a unified entity, or will internal divisions reshape its path forward? And if the directive is fully implemented, what kind of economic and political landscape will emerge in its aftermath? And perhaps most importantly, are we witnessing a temporary disruption or the early stages of a fundamental transformation in how global relationships are defined and maintained? Because if it is the latter, then this moment will not be remembered as an isolated Gitnar, but as the beginning of a new chapter that few were prepared to face. And if you want to follow every development, every revelation, and every hidden detail as this story continues to unfold, make sure you stay tuned and subscribe, because what happens next may change everything.